this year. So, just
Yeah.
go with it. Hang on for the ride.
Yeah. Colleen and I have good conversations every time I get off.
My husband says it's not boring being married to me. I'm like,
oh,
what happened today?
Yeah. This could be a good sitcom. Seriously, you get a creative writer in here and take some of the stories.
Parks and Rec.
I was just gonna say, if you haven't watched any Parks and Rec, you should.
Yeah, that one kind of passed me by. Maybe I should. Well, Amber, I see you're in house. No outside trees, bushes.
I am. It's kind of smoky, so we'll see. I might move around today. You may be surprised at the next meeting. Who knows where I'm going to be?
Yeah, it's a long day, so yeah.
It helps me to move around a little bit just to kind of break. Yeah, feel like you're in a different place, but I've got a comfy chair. Can kind of monitor what's going on in the house a little bit.
Oh yeah. I've never spent as much time downstairs as I have since being on city council and doing the Zooming. It's like another house down here. Because the upstairs is a walk-in and then we have a walk-out downstairs with a couple of bedrooms, and I'm kind of liking this.
That's good. Your house is probably quieter than mine is. So mine is about trying to find those quiet spaces.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but we are live and live on YouTube. And do I need to make anybody a co-host?
Yeah, just me, please, Kara. Jordan. All right, I think we can probably go ahead and get started. Good morning. I'm going to call the Land Use and Planning Committee to order. I will give the virtual meeting spiel, I guess, for anyone who's been under a rock for the past 5 months. We are meeting virtually, Kara, can you put up the public participation slide, please? You can attend this meeting by visiting our website, ci.missoula.mt.us/webcasts. There you'll find meetings to join the live meeting via Zoom. You can also watch on the city's YouTube channel or on Spectrum Cable channel 190. If you would like to provide comment throughout the meeting, I will provide opportunities for public comment, that'll be through the Zoom hand raise feature. If you need to join the meeting by phone, you can find information on doing that on the agenda. What else? You can also call and leave a voicemail at 406-552-6012. So our first item of business is roll call. I will go through the roll. Looks like Anderson is absent, Becerra is present, Contos is present, Harp is present, Hess is present, Jones is present, Merritt is absent, Ramos is present, Cheryl is present, Vasika is present, Von Lossberg is present, and West is absent. And Julie Merritt just joined us. There's no one in the waiting room for public comment. I will take public comment again throughout the meeting. So we can move on to, I'm sorry, we have 2 sets of minutes to approve from last week, from both of our LUP meetings last week. Without objection, those will be approved. And then for the record, Heidi West and Stacy Anderson are also here now. Okay, we have 2 regular items of committee business. The first is an appointment or 2 reappointments to the City Board of Adjustment. Mayor Engen is not present in the meeting, but The first item is to confirm reappointment of Caitlin Hepburn as a regular member and Don Briggs as an alternate member to the City Board of Adjustment. And I would entertain a motion to approve those appointments. Heather.
I am happy to make the recommended motion. Great.
That motion is in order. Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? Is there public comment on the motion? Okay, seeing none, we will take a roll call vote. And I'm not sure if Kara or Soraya, if you are able to call the roll, if there's a microphone at that computer, I can call it if that's preferable.
My mic works.
Okay, great. Could we have a roll call vote for item 5 or 3.1?
Sure.
Thanks.
Stacy Anderson,
Yes.
Mertha Becerra,
Yes.
John Contos,
Yes.
Heather Harp,
Yes.
Jordan Hess,
Yes.
Gwen Jones,
Yes.
Jolie Merritt,
Yes.
Jesse Ramos, Jesse Ramos is
Yes.
sorry. Amber
Oh,
Sherrill,
yes.
Yes.
Sandra Vaseca,
Yes.
Brian von Lotsberg,
Yes.
Heidi Best,
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously. So we'll spend the balance of the meeting with the Title 20 amendments. This is the annual amendment package to Title 20. We've seen this before. I believe it was in May, where we had a summary of the amendments. Since that time, this item has been out for public and agency comment. We've received comments through Engage Missoula as well as directly to staff. Those are summarized on the agenda. This has also been to Planning Board and has been reviewed by Planning Board. Planning Board does have some suggestions, which we'll take up later on throughout this amendment package. What I'd like to do today, Jen Gress is here from Development Services to lead the presentation. We also have Montana James and Ben Brewer here, and I believe that Ben and Montana are going to be participating in various aspects of the presentation. What I'd like to do, since this is such a lengthy package of amendments, we have 2 hours. What I'd like to do is go through all of the proposed amendments, and I'd ask you to hold all of your questions until the end. And please make a note of a section number or a slide number or something for a point of reference. So we'll get through the presentation, and then we'll go back section by section and have discussion and any amendments that are needed. Everyone good with that process? Okay, great. So, and then we'll take public comment at that time as well after we complete the presentation and discussion. So Jen, you can go ahead and take it away.
Good morning. For the record, I am Jen Gress with Development Services. And there we go. As Jordan said, today's discussion will cover the proposed amendments to update Title 20. I'll provide some background, cover key topics, review the amendments, and then ask you to set a public hearing at the end. The city zoning ordinance includes a mandate to maintain and update the text of the ordinance on a regular basis. And this process of regular review and update allows staff to collect potential amendments and propose changes in an efficient way while also complying with all the amendment procedures set forth in Chapter 2085 of the Zoning Code. Part of updating the regulations includes keeping current with city guiding policy and best practices. And this project supports the city's strategic framework by continuing to refine land use regulations that provide predictability. In the past, we've had as many as 71 amendments and as few as 13, and this year's package proposes 41 amendments in 13 different chapters. The process so far has included an initial meeting with this committee to discuss the proposed amendments generally, receiving approval to continue with the project. Agency and public comment was requested beginning June 16th, along with several other outreach methods. Because of the current COVID situation, the time to collect comments was extended from the usual 2 weeks to a full month. Staff attended the August Riverfront Leadership Team meeting, gave a presentation to the Planning Board on August 26th, and are before you today requesting to set a date for a City Council public hearing. So notification of this year's maintenance items included an agency and interested party memo, again sent out June 16th. Project information has been included on the city's webpage, which included the city's new Engage Missoula website. You have 2 reports attached to the referral regarding that. Information was included on the front of Development Services webpage. The city's news flash option was used twice to notify the public, as well as the city's Civic Send program. The Office of Neighborhood sent notice to their contacts. Legal ads have appeared in Missoulian, and information was shared at the monthly development community meeting. The proposed Title 2020 update amendments are subject to and meet the review criteria stated in Title 20, Section 2085-040G, zoning amendments review criteria. So this year's package will implement portions of the housing policy, mostly around ADUs. Amendments will create consistency between the planning, engineering, and building divisions. Proposed amendments will focus the conditional use process on the proposed use rather than design. Other amendments will consolidate the notification process and make it more effective. And as always, will address regulations that no longer apply, are ineffective, or are in error. I'll be describing the amendment ideas in 6 groupings. The presentation will be a combination of summary amendments and specific language changes depending on what that amendment is. And our first group is implementing recommendations from the Missoula housing policy that address changes to ADU regulations and integrate a definition of affordable housing. In 2013, the City Council established Ordinance 3493 establishing standards for developing new ADUs, with the intent to allow small-scale accessory residential that typically have minimal impacts in our community while providing new housing options. In spring of 2018, Title 20 was updated to remove the conditional process for detached ADUs, making ADUs possible by right in all zoning districts. Over that timeline and up to this year, the city has seen an increase of about 3 to 4 ADUs coming online each year, with a current total of 30 ADUs having been permitted. Today, you're considering updating ADU standards in order to promote greater access to this building type as an affordable and sustainable housing option. Recommended changes include reducing required parking, allowing flexibility in setbacks, removing the required minimum square footage, raising the maximum height, and removing owner occupancy requirements, as well as a local definition for affordable housing. I'll be describing the amendment ideas and groupings again, and will refer to the numbers in the Planning Board Review Amendments document that was attached to your agenda. So as just noted, amendments proposed to implement recommendations from the housing policy will mostly occur in the accessory dwelling unit chapter and include amendments 2 through 6. And these amendments remove several regulations that may inhibit a proposed ADU, and they include removal of the annual permit, owner occupancy requirement, and will remove the need for additional parking while maintaining existing parking. Other proposed amendments will remove the requirement that an ADU be a minimum of 350 square feet and will raise the height limit from 22 feet to 25 feet. In 2018, amendments were adopted into Title 20 permitting ADUs by right in all zoning districts. So proposed Amendment 7 removes the term by right and is a housekeeping amendment. When ADUs were permitted in all districts, council agreed to have a grace period allowing owners of existing illegal ADUs a limited time opportunity to comply with the new regulations by registering their unit and bringing it up to code with no penalties. This grace period has expired and the language needs to be removed. Proposed amendments to the off-street parking schedule reflect proposed amendments in other sections, allowing Title 20 to support Missoula's adopted housing policy. Staff is proposing to replace the definition of subsidized with a new definition of affordable housing and removing language requiring parking for an accessory dwelling unit. So changes will need to be made in the off-street parking schedule. And as a note, any existing parking that meets the requirement for the primary house will still need to be maintained or replaced. Language is proposed that will allow an existing accessory structure that may be non-conforming because it's placed inside the setback to be replaced, and will allow existing or new structures an opportunity to expand along that established building line subject to conditions. The amendment is proposed to support the use of existing structures when developing an ADU. So for example, our community has many existing garages, carriage houses, and accessory structures that are built close to the property line. They could have a second story added on now, but current regulations require the structure to be set back to meet the required setbacks of the zoning district. And this can be extremely challenging with an ADU that's allowed a maximum of 600 square feet. All other standards in the ADU chapter will continue to apply, including size limits and architectural requirements. So this language is modeled after the approach we took for improvements to existing non-conforming primary residences. Together with the Housing and Community Development, staff created a local definition of affordable housing that links to the tiered affordable housing incentive program established in the housing policy. This definition will enable housing and community development to create programs that are nimble and responsive to the unique needs of Missoula, rather than being held to a federal definition of subsidized that does not represent the housing challenges that Missoulians face. So this slide shows the rest of the affordable housing definition and the specific tiers used in evaluating those applications. As just discussed, proposed Amendment 11 will redefine affordable housing, and amending the definition of affordable housing requires amendments throughout Title 20 to make the regulations consistent, including this amendment in the PUD chapter and the other amendments discussed in the parking chapter previously. Of all the responses from citizens received to date, the majority include comments on the ADU amendments. Comments received regarding ADUs are about half in support and half against one or more proposed ADU amendment. So those against express concerns ranging from a disagreement with every ADU amendment to individual sections of those amendments. Specific concerns include the removal of parking that may increase already congested on-street parking or may create more work for our law enforcement. One suggestion was to review the need for parking by project. Other objections to ADU amendments include the removal of owner occupancy, removal of the annual permit program, a concern that ADUs may become tourist homes and may degrade the character of the neighborhood. And additionally, doubt was expressed whether these amendments would help with affordability concerns at all. Most comments received in support of the ADU amendment supported all of the proposed amendments and referred to the need to provide new and affordable housing opportunities throughout the city. Other comments received were in support of specific amendments. And those individual sections that received support include simplifying and increasing the maximum height, removing the minimum square footage, and removing the parking requirement. Additional comments pointed out the difficulty of incorporating a second story on an ADU, within the proposed 22-foot height maximum. A suggestion was also made to possibly lower the height of an ADU to be as tall as the maximum building height for the primary structure. Staff received support from the Missoula Parking Services Director regarding removal of the required parking space for new ADUs, and staff has been working closely with the Housing and Community Development Office, who are also in support of the ADU amendments. So based on comments received, staff increased the proposed height of ADUs from 22 to 25 feet and support a more usable space on top of accessory structures like a garage. And a clarification of AMI was included in the definition of affordable housing. Other comments regarding ADUs were evaluated and did not result in any proposed changes. And now what I'd like to do is turn the presentation over to Montana James of the Housing and Community Development Office.
Thanks, Jen. Good morning. My name is Montana James. I'm the Community Development Manager in the Office of Housing and Community Development. And as Jen mentioned, all of the proposed updates to Title 20 related to accessory dwelling units are supported by our office and are also a part of the housing policy that City Council adopted in June of 2019. So I wanted to provide a quick background on that housing policy process as we're looking at these changes more than a year later, just as a quick refresher. So Missoula's housing policy, A Place to Call Home, was developed over the course of 2 years and depended really heavily on the collaboration of a 28-member steering committee composed of community members, elected officials, and housing experts in the community. 7 technical work groups, also composed of housing advocates, housing experts, and city and county staff, as well as the support of a consultant who has worked in housing affordability across the nation for many years. And the ultimate resulting policy contained over 30 specific recommendations for how to improve housing affordability in Missoula. So these accessory dwelling unit updates are one component of that policy. I know we're all familiar with housing challenges that we're facing in Missoula. We read about them and hear about them from our neighbors every day. And accessory dwelling units play an important, if relatively small, role in our strategy as a city to improve housing affordability for Missoulians. They are key because they provide a diverse and flexible home type that can meet some really unique needs of our residents. They can allow folks to age in place, to live at home while they're going to college, or they can help young families pay off their mortgages more quickly, just to name a few of the stories we heard during the development of housing policy. We also plan to incentivize accessory dwelling unit owners to rent their units to housing voucher holders, providing a much needed option for folks in the community who have a voucher and are looking for a home in which to use it. From an administrative perspective, by utilizing existing city infrastructure, ADUs combine an ecological and a financial benefit when compared to the more costly expansion on the urban fringe. And the deployment of ADUs in existing neighborhoods also reduces the need for auto transportation, a source of about 25% of greenhouse gases, and supports alternative modes of transportation like walking, biking, public transit. So the wider adoption of accessory dwelling unit development represents a housing approach strongly aligned with the city's focus inward growth policy. And if you could go to the next slide for me, thanks. So given that kind of bigger picture and background, I wanted to give some additional background and respond to some of the comments that we've heard on a few of the specific recommended changes. In relation to parking, Jen mentioned that the conditional use process was removed for ADUs in Missoula in 2018. And since that change made detached ADUs a by right construction type, we've seen few actually constructed. Of the 30 total ADUs that Jen mentioned that are online in Missoula, only about 6 of those were constructed since that conditional use change in 2018. So the volume is pretty small. Because ADUs are relatively rare and because ADU households have fewer cars than other households, ADUs have little effect on parking conditions. But the repercussions of the current parking requirement are pretty significant for folks looking to build an accessory dwelling unit. So the current city regulations require an on-site parking space for a newly constructed ADU, along with bringing any non-conforming parking up to current standards, which often requires a total of 3 on-site parking spaces for most homes. And this represents a significant amount of lot area and construction cost increase that makes many potential lots just infeasible for construction of an accessory dwelling unit, or would make the rent needed to cover the debt service for that accessory dwelling unit much less affordable. Not only that, for many areas of the city, creating an additional off-street parking space is functionally a zero-sum game. Mandating a new on-site parking space often requires a curb cut that eliminates an existing on-street parking spot that has already been paid for and is available for public use. So the parking regulation as it currently stands in Title 20 from a housing perspective is ineffective and a barrier for most Missoula homeowners who want to construct an accessory dwelling unit. In terms of owner occupancy, excuse me, currently in regulation at the time of construction, the homeowner has to record both an affidavit and a deed restriction that run with the land and are assumed by subsequent owners that require an owner occupant on one of the two units on the property in perpetuity. This owner occupancy requirement presents significant barriers to the construction of ADUs because the recordation of deed restriction has the tendency to complicate the process of obtaining financing or limit the types of mortgage financing available for the home when it's resold to a new buyer. There's also a secondary effect when a property owner no longer resides on site, which can happen, as jobs change, seasonal work, etc. And that results in a potential rental unit that has to be legally removed from the market for little to no community benefit. So this permanent deed restriction ultimately devalues the investment homeowners make in their properties when they build an accessory dwelling unit and poses financing barriers at every step along the process. And I know that some of the opposition to removing that owner occupancy requirement is related to the concern that it will increase the number of accessory dwelling units being used for short-term rentals or tourist homes in Missoula ordinance language. And of the 144 currently registered tourist homes in Missoula, 80% are single-family homes and just 8% are accessory dwelling units. So I think the key here is that regulating tourist homes via ADU code is not good policy and will ultimately be ineffective, clearly given the much broader scope of the tourist home issue in Missoula. We wouldn't debate that it may be time for the city of Missoula to revisit our tourist home ordinance, but it's staff's recommendation that policy and regulations related to tourist homes should be examined more holistically and live in that section of code, because attempting to regulate tourist homes simply via accessory dwelling unit code will not in any effective way solve the bigger tourist home challenges or issues that we're seeing. And rather it will continue to limit Missoulians' ability to construct accessory dwelling units and keep us in a position where we have limited options to provide the diversity of home types Missoulians want and need. So thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly on the code changes and their background in our city housing policy. And I will turn it back to Jen to talk about the rest of the code updates.
Thanks, Montana. Further on in the amendments now, we're going to start talking about coordinating between interagency regulations. So amendments are being proposed to Title 20 that will create consistency with existing engineering terms and address potential amendments between the engineering and building divisions, which will shift accessibility review to the building division. Amendments 12, 13, and 15 propose to change terminology in specific locations of Title 20 from driveway to driveway approach to match terminology used in engineering, depending on whether the area being discussed and regulated is in the right-of-way or on a private parcel. References to engineering review of accessibility requirements will be replaced with a reference to the building division because of proposed amendments to engineering and building rules. The building division has the ability to review accessibility issues through the International Building Code, and those are amendments 14, 17, and 18. And Amendment 16 makes two changes. The first will clarify when a driveway is involved in a project, the engineering division must approve the driveway prior to issuance of any zoning compliance permit or building permit. And that change is made by adding the reference to the building permit. The second amendment will remove duplicate language addressing maximum grade of a driveway from Title 20 while retaining it in the engineering division. Comments received regarding coordination with engineering and building divisions were considered, but no results didn't result in any changes to our proposed amendments. And these comments included a request to keep language regarding the maximum grade and distance for longer driveways. So again, this language exists in both the zoning and engineering regulations and will be removed from zoning but retained in engineering. A second request was to retain ADA references in the zoning code. ADA regulations are federally enforced, and Missoula has limited ability to inspect or enforce those regulations. The ability provided by the federal government is contained in the building code, and the building division will be responsible for those items. This section will be a general review of the amendments to the conditional use section of Title 20. Planning Board did make a recommended change to this section, and I'll describe that amendment later in the presentation, and staff will present some alternative language at that point. So amendments to the conditional use section are being proposed with the goal of focusing the conditional use approval process on the proposed land use and relying more on existing regulations and other review processes for associated design of a project. So this will help focus evaluating impacts on orderly development of land use rather than project design details. Proposed Amendment 19 will remove the necessity of providing very specific elevation and landscape plans, letting an applicant provide general information about site layout and design. While the intent of these amendments is to generalize the review of conditional use project, the section still needs to be clear that the entirety of Title 20 and any approved conditions to a project still need to be adhered to, and this is shown in Amendment 21. Amendments 20, 22, and 23 clarify the conditional use review process. Most of the existing factors to be considered are more appropriately placed under review criteria, so they have some sort of weight in the decision-making process prior to the City Council review. And these have been moved from subsection I to subsection H. Staff felt that factor number 1 is too vague and not helpful, so it was removed. The last item remaining in the factors to be considered is a reference to public and agency comment. Amendment 20 includes a reference in the hearing and final action section, making sure that comment is still considered in the decision-making process. Other modifications to the criteria focus on the general relationship of the proposal on a site and in relationship to adjacent uses, while de-emphasizing design details like material and color, and help implement the plans and policies that have been adopted by Missoula. Comments regarding conditional use amendments included concern that elimination of a required elevation plan may affect other city services and processes that would require an elevation drawing, and that changes to this section don't help to promote additional or affordable housing. The next topic is the sign chapter, and the first deals with dynamic display signs. And those are the signs that are electric and function somewhat like a TV. The dynamic display sign section lists districts where the signs are permitted as well as prohibited. It was brought to staff's attention that neither section included the B districts. So after researching the language, staff created a zoning officer opinion addressing the gap and permitting dynamic display signs in B districts along principal arterials. Proposed Amendment 24 will clarify where dynamic display signs are permitted by incorporating that zoning officer opinion. Amendment 24 will also remove the prohibited locations section in the sign chapter, since we also have a where allowed section, focusing the regulations on where the signs are permitted and helping to remove any confusion there may be. Building graphics only need to be reviewed by one decision-making body, and Amendment 25 clarifies that. And the last change will remove the requirement that staff provide identification tags with every sign permit. The identification tags have not proven useful and the language will be removed. And there were no comments regarding the signs chapter. In an effort to create greater consistency between processes, notice requirements are being updated and consolidated into a new notice section in Chapter 2085 Review and Approval. This action will consolidate and clarify the notification requirements for all types of projects administered by Title 20, resulting in an ease of use and consistency of notification procedures. Amendments 30, 31, and 32 encompass a majority of those changes regarding notice by taking the notification pieces out of multiple Title 20 sections and reorganizing them into a new notice section in the review and approval chapter. Additional language changes will include adding a quick reference table and an intent statement. Notifying owners within 150 feet of a proposed project will be made consistent. Newspaper notice will be made consistent across all processes. Certified mail will be removed, but notice by first-class mail will continue. And a directive for an applicant to maintain any required on-site notification has been included. So this is the reference table that places all that notice information into one place that's easily accessed and reviewed. Pardon me. Amendment 27 moves the notice process from the townhome exemption development section into the new notice section. Amendment 33 amends the administrative adjustment notification, making it consistent with the timeline of all other notice in Title 20 at 15 days rather than 20 days. And amendments 28 and 29 will remove the necessity of an applicant to notice surrounding parcels of a proposed tourist home or ADU, but staff will continue to notice surrounding parcels of an approved tourist home or ADU. Planning board made a recommended change to number 28, and I'll cover that later on in the presentation. Comments regarding notice amendments included concern over removing the required applicant notice to surrounding parcels for tourist homes because neighbors would be notified after the fact. Other comments included the suggestion that notice should be consistent at 30 days instead of 15, and all neighborhood changes should be noticed by newspaper posting and mailed to those within 150 feet. The last group of amendments is a miscellaneous category and includes various amendments without a common theme. So the first two changes occur in the overlay district chapter. Amendment 34 will rectify an oversight in the Airway Boulevard corridor subdistrict of the Missoula Development Park overlay zone, and it'll incorporate the use light equipment sales and rentals into the district. And the second amendment will clarify glazing is not included in the calculation of material coverage for development going through a design excellence review. And that change just reflects current practice. The adoption of Title 20 in 2009 removed the need for new enterprise commercial overlays by making EC uses either permitted or conditional. And in 2018, the existing older EC overlays were removed from the zoning map. So the regulations need to reflect these changes, and Amendment 36 will remove irrelevant language. Excuse me. There's been confusion about when a project is subject to the hillside protection regulations, and if it's subject to the chapter, which sections apply to which types of projects. So proposed Amendment 37 will clarify the applicability section by specifying which sections of the regulations apply to which types of projects. Amendment 38 occurs in the landscaping chapter and provides additional guidance for developers when they propose to include garden areas as part of their required landscaping in a multi-dwelling project. Amendments were proposed by the Parks Department and, among other things, require access to a centrally located water bib and that the garden be in an area receiving adequate sunlight. The landscaping chapter also has an exemption for meeting the letter of the chapter by allowing a landscape architect to create an alternate landscaping plan. So this amendment asks for an explanation of how a proposed landscape plan provided by that landscape architect is going to meet the intent of the landscaping chapter. Amendment 40 will allow design review board members to reside either in the city or outside the city limits, making recruiting and retention of these voluntary positions a little easier. And then the last proposed amendment will include language in the use classification section, allowing utility services to place on site any type of equipment necessary to allow the facility to function properly. Staff received comments in support and opposition to the garden area requirements in the landscaping chapter, as well as the proposed changes to the landscape exemption. An additional comment was made to retain all DRB membership as city residents. Other comments were evaluated and did not result in any proposed changes. Amendments to the activity area requirements in the general site landscaping section only include amendments to address changes proposed by the Parks and Recreation Department. So the size and dimension of an activity area and a change to the number of units required to implement specific landscape changes are outside the scope of this set of amendments and cannot be addressed in this review cycle. And finally, 2 comments were received that didn't pertain to the amendments. The first expressed support for affordable and high density housing in general, as well as support for encouraging small, high density units. And the second expressed support for the removal of a single family residential district and parking maximums instead of minimums. So these are comments that deal with the larger context of addressing affordable housing needs in Missoula, but again, are not part of the scope of these limited amendments. So the next section will give you some background on what happened at the planning board. So on August 11th, staff attended a planning board meeting and presented the proposed amendments. Planning board recommended approval of the package subject to 2 recommended amendments. The first recommendation, which is motion 1, discussed proposed amendment number 28 shown in the planning board review packet. This proposed amendment would remove the requirement for an applicant to notify surrounding parcels regarding their application for a tourist home from the tourist home process. Planning board discussed the merits of an applicant notification and felt that it should still continue because it promoted neighborliness. So planning board motioned to retain the requirement that applicants notify surrounding parcels of their intent to apply for a tourist home, essentially rejecting the amendment number 28 and retaining the language that's shown here in gray. The second recommendation, motion number 2, discussed amendment number 22, again shown in the planning board review version. The proposed amendment would amend the language to support a more general approach to review in the conditional use section. Planning board motioned to retain the existing language in proposed subparagraph G, with the exception of the word color. Their suggested changes are shown in gray. Discussion focused on including additional design considerations that could affect the positive relationship of the use to adjacent parcels. After the hearing discussion, staff considered this motion in the context of the overall intent of the amendments and feels other options need to be explored. So right now I'm going to pass the presentation over to Ben Brewer, who is from Development Services. And Ben will provide some additional background regarding why we included the changes in the update package to begin with, and we'll provide some staff alternatives for you to consider.
Thanks, Jen. Good morning, council members. For the record, I'm Ben Brewer with Development Services. And I wanted to kind of step back from the specific language for the amendments that we had proposed here for the conditional use changes, just to step back and look at why we had recommended them in the first place. And because the planning board recommendation kind of brought up some more questions for us as we discussed it amongst staff and internally about what those would mean and whether we would reach the intent that we were aiming for with this. So the reason that we brought these amendments in the first place originally was kind of for 2 main reasons. The first was to try to separate out design review from conditional use approvals and the conditional use approval process. A big reason for this is that we have several types of design review standards and levels of design review already that exist within the zoning, if not other city regulations, including everything from just general zoning standards like setbacks and height limits and landscaping requirements and whatnot that include screening and that kind of thing, to the new design excellence overlay, which is a very comprehensive look at design, and then a number of use and building specific standards that are in the zoning as well, which include enterprise commercial, big commercial developments over 30,000 square feet, a separate set of standards for commercial development under 30,000 square feet. So that would apply to any commercial development outside of the design excellence overlay, and then multi-dwelling building standards and casino standards and whatnot. So there's a number of use and building specific standards that are in the zoning currently that any project would necessarily have to meet in order to be approved for building permit. And so that's one consideration here. And then along with that is that again, with the goal of providing certainty to the development processes that the city administers, going back to, our city strategic plan and whatnot, that by requiring, a complete design ahead of a conditional use approval or application, really, that's a fairly onerous requirement, especially if there may be changes to that design or redesign that come out of a condition that comes out of the conditional use approval. So the goal here is to kind of switch that order of things so that if there's a project that needs to know whether the use is even allowed in the first place, that we would discuss that during the conditional use approval process, and then they would go forth from there and work on the design. And then, along with that, the next main focus of this is to refocus, what are the impacts of the use being considered on the site and the surrounding area, and refocusing the what comes out of a conditional use approval, so that the conditions are aimed at that rather than necessarily the final design of a project. Jen, can we go to the next slide? So again, that's kind of the overview of why we brought these. When the planning board made the recommendation, it brought up more conversation, and basically we talked it through and realized that maybe we had not gone far enough to remove the design consideration from what would be involved in the conditional use application. And so we kind of are at a point now where we think we have 4 routes to move forward with. One would be to accept the planning board recommendation as is and move forward. The second would be to reject that specific planning board recommendation and move forward with what we had proposed originally. A third would be that we reject the planning board recommendation and adopt some new staff alternative changes that we've developed since planning board or would be developing. And I'm gonna walk you through that here in just a second. And then, the fourth route would be that we talk about withdrawing these proposed changes addressing conditional use for this round of amendments, and maybe bring that back at a later date when we've had a chance to work through it some more. Jen, can we go to the next slide? So if there's consideration for that third route of moving forward with additional new language, I'm gonna just walk you through what that could or would look like as we've figured it so far. The first additional language would be in the application filing section, where originally we had talked about removing the requirement for elevation drawings and added language about general site layout plan or general kind of plans, with the idea being that that would provide some sense for consideration of what a project would look like. In this case, we would even remove those and look at the most basic level for a conditional use application, receiving information specifically responding to the review criteria, which is in section H, which we'll look at as well. And then a project narrative. And then, of course, if there are other materials that an applicant would want to submit or think would be helpful for your review, of course they would could submit that, but it would not necessarily be a requirement. Again, with the idea being that we want to establish whether the use is even approvable before getting into the design of a project specifically. Jen, can we go to the next slide, please? This is just to say that the hearing and final action section would remain as we'd proposed it originally. Next slide, please. And then this section H is the review criteria section. This is mainly what we had proposed originally, except that the statement at the top in blue, we would move to a separate section specifically called compliance with conditions. And I'll talk about that when we get there. But there, the first few review criteria would stay the same as staff had proposed, including removing the requirement that a project meet zoning, as Jen had said earlier, that has can be vague, and also adds to that onerousness of a application, where if you need to show that you meet zoning ahead of a conditional use application, you basically need to have designed a project to show that you meet that. So that we would remove that. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then the rest of the review criteria section, we would look at a couple more additional changes and additional language. This new section D is adding language, although it's basically combining that with one of the substandards in the factors to be considered section. As we had proposed originally, all of the factors to be considered, except for agency comment, would get moved up into the review criteria. For those of you who might be new to conditional uses, we have kind of two tiers of review factors that can be looked at in the conditional use. The review criteria is what we want to see addressed in the application, and factors to be considered kind of lists things that may come up during the hearing. And so we, to make it more clear what's expected in an application, are proposing that we move everything into review criteria, except for the comment section that will come in as the hearing moves along. So those, that section D would be kind of combining both of those that address transportation and whatnot. And then in section F, we're proposing that we would also remove the building orientation language, as that again gets into project design. And then subsection G is really where it gets into the nuts and bolts of what about design might be considered. And so again, to really clarify that we want to separate out design from the consideration, we're talking about removing also, along with what we had proposed already, the mention of volume and mass management, and the proposed building and structures, and just focusing again on uses. So, and then also adding language about buffering, as that might be the kind of screening and buffering potentially could be the kinds of conditions that would come out of something like this. If you can move to the next slide, Jen. Again, the factors to be considered, as we proposed earlier, would be moved up to the section G and or section H, sorry, except for agency and public testimony. And then next slide, please. And lastly, the new proposed language would be a new section called compliance with conditions. And something that would be new here, as opposed to how conditional use applications have been administered previously, is the idea of what is substantial compliance with conditions. And so the way that we've been administering conditional uses is that an applicant submits an application packet, which includes a full design of their project, and the approval is based on that application as amended by conditions, which is kind of a similar approach to how our subdivision approvals work and that kind of thing. The goal here would be to retain the condition language just to be on the face of them or on their own. So that rather than refer back to what's in the application and generating the need to hold a project to that specific design potentially, we want to move how compliance with the conditions works to looking at the conditions specifically, which we can review then along with the project for all the other city regulations that might apply to it when it gets to the building permit stage. So that's the end of our new proposed language, if you could go to the next slide, Jen. And then again, I just want to bring it back to these are kind of our four, best steps forward. If we went with the third route, then we'd be looking at the language that we just ran through as being newly proposed language. And that's all I had for now. Let's see if you have any questions.
So thank you, Ben. So at the last thing that we have then again is that we are asking for you to set a public hearing. So staff recommends that City Council set a hearing for October 5th to consider amendments to Title 20, including any proposed recommended motions from Planning Board and yourself. And that's the end of the presentation. We're happy to answer questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Jen and Ben and Montana, I appreciate your all of your time and effort on these amendments and the thorough presentation today. What I'd like to do is walk through the document in a sort of systematic way. I'm looking on our agenda under agenda item 3.2, attachment number 4 is the Title 20 Planning Board Review Amendments PDF. And I'm going to use that as a framework for walking through questions. That follows the same outline as the presentation. Starting on page 4 of that document, there's a summary reference list. And so we can start with coordination with the Missoula housing policy. This is amendments number 1 through 11. And these primarily, but not exclusively, relate to the ADUs. And so if anyone has any questions or any discussion or anything like that at this time, we can go through those. Okay, Julie?
Sorry, I don't want to jump in too soon. If I guess the previous comments that we've about the removing the owner occupancy requirement, but still are concerning to me. I hear what Montana James described to us, that what we're trying to do is have people use ADUs more as a tool for affordable housing. But I continue to be concerned that that's not going to happen. I guess I'll pose this question. Montana, you made reference to incentivizing people to rent ADUs to voucher holders. Maybe you could describe for us the process that you think we can put in place to incentivize that?
Sure. Yeah, the housing policy speaks more to this, and the establishment of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is a key component or kind of first step to that. So we plan to use the Affordable Housing Trust Fund for all of those incentives programs, whether it's incentivizing the development of affordable homes or voucher holders. So typically what we would do is sketch out and create a more robust program with specific requirements, but typically it would be, in return for some sort of investment or support of the construction of the accessory dwelling unit, then the owner would need to rent or give preference to voucher holders. It might be that through the trust fund, we can support permitting fees or, any component of the construction. And then in return for a set period of time through a contract that the homeowner would use that unit and rent it long-term to a voucher holder.
Okay. Thanks. Julie, do you have additional questions, or are you done at this time?
I guess my other question in that around the ADUs is the removal of the requirement that notice be given when the application is made, but maybe that is better saved for a little bit later in this discussion.
Okay. we can hold that for later. Gwen?
Thanks. So I had noted that there was discussion in all of the documents about going from 22 to 25 feet height requirement for the ADUs, and that incentivizes, well, that allows basically for different roof types besides a shed type roof. And I just wanted to circle back again. I think we cleared this up back in May. That was a long time ago when we discussed this, but my understanding is we are not getting rid of the requirement for ADUs that they must match the style and cladding of the house, the main house on the property. And so going from 22 to 25 feet gives, like, for example, in the University District, most of those houses are pitched roofs, not shed roofs. So this creates more flexibility to match that type of roof. Am I clear on all of this, Jen? Am I getting it right?
It's true, yes. We're not changing any of the other criteria design-wise, so they'll still need to substantially match the existing house.
Okay, and can I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead.
If there are, for example, if there's a very small house in front that's 12 to 15 feet high, this can go up to 25 feet high. That will be a change in that the rear unit can be higher, but in my mind, it is still at 25 feet for the most part, it is still scaled to the unit in the front. So we're not having a mismatch of a 12-foot high house and a 35-foot unit in the back, but it's basically scaled. We're dictating it's to be scaled by the amount of no more than 25 feet. Correct? Jen's nodding. Okay.
Sorry, yes. I was, yes.
Let the record reflect Jen is nodding. And so, Jordan, I have an amendment I would propose regarding parking. Are you entertaining amendments at this point, or is this just questions, or what do you want to do? And I assume during committee, you want to hash through amendments, not put this off till full council, but what's your preference?
So I think there's a couple of things we can do. We can propose amendments and go through those and set the public hearing based on the amendments. We can also submit multiple drafts to the public hearing. And so since the public hearing is, really the official vehicle to get another round of public comments, we could make amendments and send both drafts as as public hearing material. We could also just sort of flag items as as being of interest, and we could come back later. What I'd kind of like to do today is maybe state the intention of your amendment, but then let's maybe see how we end up with questions, and then come back to amendments later on in the meeting today, if that works.
Sure. Would you entertain that now then? Do you want me to
go ahead.
Voice my thoughts? So in terms of ADUs in Ward 3, this has always been a big issue, and especially in the University District. And I certainly acknowledge that history. There are some significant changes to ADU, our current ADU ordinance proposed here. And the one that I really want to focus on is parking. And I certainly understand and comprehend that by eliminating the parking requirement, I think that will work in many areas of town for ADUs, but I think we need to carve out an exception for the University District because it has much greater pressures than pretty much any other dense neighborhood in Missoula. And the issue is parking is already greatly impacted in the U District between the University of Montana, which has 10,000 students plus staff and faculty, the Hip Strip, which is a busy commercial area, Hellgate High School, which has 12 to 1,300 students plus staff when they are in session. And not to mention there's people who are parking in the University District and walking across to go downtown to work. So there's some serious parking impacts there. Currently, we have the residential parking permit program, which only encompasses basically the 400 and 500 blocks in the University District in the historical section and a little bit outside of the historical section. And then in blocks 100, 200, and 300, they get all of the overflow. So there is no parking. It's at 100% when the university is in session, especially. So there is no flow there, which is what you optimally want with parking on the street. So I know that Tiffany Brander, our parking commissioner, did comment that she's fine with getting rid of the parking requirement. However, I still think this is important in that the residential parking permit program needs to be revised. And I've talked about it ever since I got on council, and it is a slow elephant to push uphill. But I think eventually in the next few years, the parking commission will get there. I went in and spoke to the parking commission's board last spring and said, you need to start looking at this. It needs to extend all the way through the hip strip. There needs to be a much more study done and a comprehensive plan, and we need to get it right to accommodate all of these different parking pressures. So in the meantime, to add ADUs in and eliminate the parking is exacerbating the situation. So my amendment that I would propose would be a carve out for the parking requirement. We keep the parking requirement for ADUs in the historic district, as well as the residential permit parking program district, those two overlapping boundaries, until at some point in the future, the parking commission holistically addresses this. And then in Title 20 cleanup, I think we could, there would then be tools to handle it. And then in the Title 20 cleanup, we could eliminate it at that point. So that is my proposal. I have one other comment. It's on a different topic. May I?
You know, I'm questioning the guidance that I gave. I think you gave an introduction of your intent, and I think maybe we should just take up amendments as they come. Does anyone on the committee have a preference about that approach? Brian, you're leaning forward. Are you?
I'm. It's a slight preference. I mean, your call. I guess personally, I would appreciate a discussion of sort of all of the topics before taking them up for action. But it's just a slight preference.
Okay, let's do that. Let's put a pin in that amendment idea, Gwen, and we'll come back to that later on. Go ahead with your other comment, and then I'll move on to.
Thanks. My final comment is, I think Montana referenced tourist homes, our short-term rentals, which we have an ordinance in place. Just as this parking issue with the parking commission, and we need holistic changes there, I think this is a separate issue with tourist homes. I have no desire to create more ADUs in Ward 3 that are basically targeted to be tourist homes. So I think, as Montana stated, this is taking a step back and looking at our tourist home ordinance, which I know some on council have discussed that we've got it in place, which was good. Now we've got the tool. We need to look at it, to tweak it, to see how we make it work better. We still want people to have flexibility and extra income at times, but we want housing stock. And we're in a dramatically shifting economy in terms of our housing inventory and housing costs. So that is also a factor with ADUs, and that is a big impact, frankly, in the neighborhoods that I represent, University District, Riverfront, in terms of ADUs. I wish that was already in place prior to doing this ADU modifications, but it's not. So we're just going to have to get to that a few months down the road. And I just wanted to articulate that I hear that issue. I saw it in the comments. I appreciate it. We can't do everything at once. We're going to have to get to that later on, but it is part of this discussion. Thank you. That's all.
Sandra.
Thanks. I have a little bit of confusion on number 9, where we're changing the terminology from subsidized to affordable housing, and where that has to do with parking. Does that have to do with if we don't require additional parking spaces, then in turn it is lower cost to the owner, which then will be lower cost to the renter? Or if that's true, then what does subsidized have to do with anything with that? Or do I have that completely wrong? Can somebody speak on that?
Jen?
The regulations, I'm going to look up that. I can also put it on the screen. Anytime somebody wants to see an amendment, just ask me. I can put them on the screen. But this is in the motor vehicle parking schedule, and in that planning board packet that you all have, if you want to look at page 13, you'll see the parking table already allows a reduced parking schedule under the name of subsidized. And it's really not changing the fact that these types of units can reduce their parking. It's changing the terminology that we're using so that we can use that newly adopted affordable housing. And I believe, and Montana can correct me, but I believe that this new tiering system that they have will allow more projects to have a slight more reduction in their parking if they go through this new, as we put in this new definition of affordable housing. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Sandra, do you have any other questions right now? Okay. Heather.
Thanks, Jordan. As many of you know, in my position as executive director for Habitat, I have a seat on the Home Coalition, which was formed coming out of the housing policy. And the whole purpose of the Home Coalition was to make sure we had a table of housing experts able to actually go through all of these types of amendments and really kind of make sure that the work that comes out of this body reflects trying to create more housing that is affordable for all Missoulians. And I want you to know that there was some dissension amongst us. We had we struggled with the idea around owner occupancy and making sure whether or not that makes the most sense. And we were pretty evenly split. And this was I think, the one and only amendment that really kind of divided us. Every other one of them, whether it was the parking requirement being removed or the building height going up to 25 feet, we were in agreement on, but it was the owner occupancy. And I just want all of you to just be aware that it wasn't a unanimous decision, but it was one that I think all of us need to understand that this is a tougher lift for sure. But I've come around to the idea that removing the owner occupancy is actually a good thing because of the fact that we've only had 30 ADUs being constructed over a number of years, as Jen had mentioned. It's not an exploding type of housing stock as much as I would like it to see it being tucked into our little neighborhoods. Just like we're talking about amendment today of removing it, if all of a sudden it just spirals out of control and we have some major issues, I think we can come back again next year or the year after that and reevaluate. But I think at this point, if we want to increase the housing stock, I think removing owner occupancy is going to make some sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Amber and then Heidi.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sorry because I don't know what slide it is. I was starting to lose track of the slide numbers a little bit, but I have some questions around the changes in the notice of tourist homes to the neighbors. And I also just want to, comment that as Gwen articulately pointed out, I have no desire to create more tourist homes in Ward 4. But I am interested in the ability to create more housing. So could you, I guess my question is, will you review again what the notice to neighbors would be regarding the tourist homes and how that would, like, one of my concerns is if they are renting the unit, and maybe I just don't understand the tourist home regulations as well as I should. If they're renting the unit and for short-term rentals, and there's a problem around it, and we're removing the owner occupancy piece, how are they getting a hold of, how are they managing some problem other than, I suppose, calling the police for a disturbance? Or if can you speak to the changes and how that would work. That wasn't very clear, I realize, but I'm worried about that piece of it.
I'll try and cover that for you. If you want to look at the amendment, it's on page 25 of the planning board document. And one of the things I want to mention before I forget is that tourist homes do not require owner occupancy on site. Just so that's the accessory dwelling units do that. The proposed amendment for the tourist home section requested that we remove the applicant's requirement to notify surrounding parcels, which would be about anywhere between, you know, a 4 to 8 number of households directly around those parcels when they chose to apply for an application, a permit. And the reason that staff was doing that was it's become apparent to us that when this becomes difficult for the public to do, they aren't getting it correct. We're having to do a bunch of training. We're not allowed to just hand out a list of addresses and people's names. It's up to the applicant to look for those. And it was delaying projects. And this notification is that it's a notice saying I'm considering putting in a tourist home. And then at the end, currently and as proposed, staff would notice those very same people that it has been approved. So it's not something that allows the neighbors to object to. It's a notification process. And because of the complexities of it, we were being asked to just remove that one step. Does that answer your questions?
I think so. You know, I guess, and maybe one of the other council people could speak to this. I guess my concern is for, and maybe this has more to do with the tourist home ordinance, you know, an ordinance around that rather than the ADUs, honestly. But if we do remove from ADUs the owner occupancy requirement, which, you know, I'm not opposed to removing that for probably a lot of reasons that Ms. Harp said were discussed. But if they do, then you don't have an owner in the house, and then you have an ADU that's potentially a tourist home, and then you have all these neighbors that kind of have. I guess my concern is just around what to do if there are problems, and if maybe this is not the right place to address it.
When I failed to cover that part, apologize. When tourist homes are approved, the applicant is required to provide to our office a list of contacts of who the owner is, what their phone number is, what their mailing address, those different kinds of things. And when staff sends out an approval letter, that information is provided to the area residents so that if there is an issue, there's someone to get hold of.
Okay, that actually makes me feel better about it, because if the neighbor's not in the house, it would be hard to figure out who to talk to about it.
Sure.
And I want to highlight that the notification is, you know, it's not part of the housing policy. It is obviously related, but the notification really is being standardized, you know, throughout the Title 20 amendment process, and so I know that got conflated a bit at the planning board, and I just wanted to make that clarification. So Amber, do you have additional questions, or are you done?
So I do have one more question, if that's okay. I'm curious about, I think it was slide 33, with the landscaping piece.
Let's hold that for now. And
oh, okay. Sorry, I'm out of order. So.
No, that's okay. Okay, Heidi, and then Julie.
All right, so I have a couple of questions. I guess my first one is around the ADU owner occupancy removal. And I believe from earlier discussions that the need for this really hinges on, I guess, the private lending side, because getting financing for this is virtually impossible. And so unless you have a lot of upfront capital, you're really restricted to even be able to build one. And I guess obviously that has to do with the deed restriction that comes with it. And so I guess my question is around what alternative tools the housing department would be thinking of using, and at what point those would get put into place, I guess at the time of like building permit completion, to get around that financing hitch, if that makes sense. Montana, do you get what I'm saying?
Right, you were breaking up a little bit. I don't know if it was just my feed. So so I guess could you restate the question?
Yeah, maybe I'll stop my video for a second. So I guess my question hinges around a lot of the difficulty with bringing ADUs to the market to begin with has to do with not being able to get that construction financing on the front end. And so I guess my question is around what alternative tools the housing department would put in place, and then are those going to be tied to the degree of investment that the city has? Yeah, just speak a little bit more to like what the tools are that the housing department is envisioning for these units.
Yeah, so the primary financing hurdle or obstacle that we found in the development of housing policy was just that owner occupancy requirement, that permanent deed restriction that stays with the home limits both. So if I'm a homeowner and I want to construct an ADU, it limits my ability to get a construction loan for the construction of that unit. So like you said, unless I have $150,000 at my disposal, there are a lot of barriers for me being able to build that ADU. And then also the owner occupancy requirement has the effect that if I do get a loan or I have the funds to build that ADU, and then a few years down the line, I need to sell my property, it limits the pool of folks who can purchase that property for the same because of that deed restriction. It's a smaller pool of people who are able to get mortgage financing for that property. So I think it's sort of two separate issues. The main barrier that we're hoping to deal with these adjustments is removing that owner occupancy, which opens up the financing tools available to homeowners in order to construct an ADU. So I guess that is kind of the tool at hand for these amendments, is removing the owner occupancy requirement, which then opens up financing tools for folks to build ADUs. I'm trying to think of, you said additional tools other than that we might use.
Yeah, so you had mentioned trying to put some restrictions for voucher holders, for example, on these ADU units, but that I would assume would be tied to future subsidy that someone would apply from, from the Housing Trust Fund or something.
Yeah, the Housing Trust Fund and capitalizing the Housing Trust Fund is sort of our basis for any of our incentives programs, which the housing policy recommends a few related to housing development and also voucher preference and accessory dwelling units. So we have to have that funding source to provide some sort of incentive or a tool to get that affordability in return from the homeowner. So once we have the trust fund established and running, then we would sketch out those programs and kind of all of the components and programmatic elements. But you're right that whether it's, that the trust fund pays for permitting fees or pays for some component of the construction of the accessory dwelling unit, then in return for that support or that incentive, the homeowner would enter into a contract saying that they will only rent to voucher holders for X number of years or provide some sort of affordability.
Okay. And then I have two more questions. I guess one has to do with, not to Montana, I think this one would be to Jen. So in the scenario that Gwen proposed to exclude the university district from, I guess, from the parking the new parking amendments, I guess I was wondering if you could kind of talk about what the fallback is. My guess would be that a lot of the university districts have non-conforming parking as it is, and so would the restriction just mean that an ADU can't be brought to the market in the university area unless 3 parking spaces could be built out on site? Is that correct?
The current regulations require that a new ADU come with a parking space, and then I believe also that it requires that any substandard parking for that existing primary unit also be included. So if you've got a non-conforming situation where there is no parking for that primary unit and you want to have an ADU, you will be required to have 3 on-site parking spaces unless you go through some other process like a variance. But I think a variance would be most difficult because they're based on hardship, and I'm not sure that would fall into the hardship process.
Do we have and this isn't specific to the university area, do we have an idea of like the scope of our community that has existing, I guess, non-conforming parking? I could see this being an issue, not just in the university area, but any older part of town. You know, not even having the basic, downtown would be a great example, Lower Rattlesnake, parts of the north side, west side.
It's not a piece of data that I am aware of. I mean, we might be able to look into that. I don't know the time consumption that would take. It's my understanding that we have not done a survey of the entire town to figure out where we have non-conforming parking.
Thanks. Then my final question is around the tourist home notice. I guess, I mean, I think it's nice for neighbors to have noticed that someone is planning on putting a tourist home into their neighborhood. But I guess my question is around whether that notice has any sort of agency for neighbors. It's just a notice, right? They don't, there isn't any sort of protestability or anything that's tied to that notice, correct?
You are correct.
Thank you. I think that's all my questions for now.
Sorry, I was talking while muted. Thanks, Heidi. Next, Julie, and then Gwen.
Thanks, Councilman Hess. I am interested in making an amendment in line with the motion number 1 from the planning board to keep the notice requirement in for the tourist home applications. And we require that applicants of all other sorts have to have professionals help them with their application. I mean, no individual walks into development services and applies for a rezone or a conditional use or a subdivision or a TED or any of these things without various levels of professionals to help them. I think someone who's applying for a tourist home can afford to get help if it's that difficult to figure out how to notice the people that are within 150 feet of their parcel. It's just not that difficult. So that's my intention, is to put forth an amendment to keep that notice requirement in.
Okay, we'll flag that as well and come back to that later on. Gwen and then Heather.
Well, that was just a beautiful segue, Julie. Thanks, because I'd actually raised my hand when Amber was talking about the notice, and I'll just piggyback on. I think that's the right direction to go in, Julie. I think it is true that neighbors can't necessarily protest a tourist home application, but it is a courtesy prior to it being done, considering that this is basically a commercial entity going into a residential neighborhood, which is pushing the envelope. As a courtesy to people, they should be given a heads up. And I agree that people can go walk around the 150 circumference of this house and look at the addresses and write them down. It's just not that hard. And I bet they've got the same zip code as their address. So I just think that as a courtesy, that can be given so that people know it's going in, they're given a heads up. They may not be happy about it, but that is easier to swallow than just getting notice after the fact, which is harder. And I don't know, I noted Ed Childers' commentary in the Engage Missoula, and I appreciated Ed plowing through all of the proposed changes and giving his commentary. And several times he used the phrase neighborhood harmony. The point is to keep neighborhood harmony. Yes, we want to increase housing stock and all of these different incentives. People are also living together and they need to treat each other the right way. So I agree, Julie, and I know that there's this effort to synchronize and streamline all of the notice issues in Title 20, but I think this is not that hard to go walk around and get the addresses and send people a letter. You may not know their names, but it can be to the resident. So that's my 2 cents on that, and thanks for bringing that up, Julie.
Jen, did the planning board suggest also keeping the changes in the noticing? I know that noticing would be done by development services under the proposed change, but did they propose a hybrid where the property owner must notify as well as staff notifying, or did they suggest just reverting back to exclusively the property owner notifying?
The current regulations do require the applicant to do it first and also requires staff to do it after approval. So okay. That's what will go, if we adopt planning board's recommendation, that will be what it is before and after. Okay.
And so if we adopt that notification, then that would be the only type of notification that would not really be in line with our new notification chapter. Is that correct, or is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay. So we'll come back to that. Heather and then Mirta.
Oh. Thanks, Jordan. Earlier in my comments, I forgot to just share some language that Paul Herendeen from the Clearwater Credit Union had supplied and he sits on our home coalition. And I think just from the financing side of things, I think it's worthwhile just hearing this out for just a second. He said, basically, Fannie Mae explicitly does not allow rental income from an EDU to count towards income for qualifying purposes. Mortgage products do exist that count this income, but they generally have higher interest rates and higher down payment requirements. Appraisers are not sure how to handle ADUs, specifically if they count as a second dwelling. And if so, the property is considered more of a duplex. Lending on these will again come with somewhat higher interest rates and down payment requirements. And then there's also the issue of selling a home with a signed lease for the ADU. So just to kind of piggyback onto what Heidi was talking about before, financing ADUs is problematic. And if we can work towards loosening these regulations at the government level, then maybe perhaps the banking institutions will be able to find a product that will allow more and more construction of ADUs. And that I think is a way that we can work together. Just wanted to add that in.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Heidi?
Thanks. Sorry, I just had one more question around the tourist home notice, because obviously there's a difference between renters versus owners and who gets notice. And I was wondering if you could specify whether it's the people that are actually living adjacent to the tourist home that get notice. So in some cases that could be a renter versus the homeowner. Because I mean, at least the renter should get notice. I mean, I think both should. And I guess how to navigate that and if it spells out who is getting the notice.
So again, the amendment is on page 25 of the planning board. And the language that's being put back in says notify all property owners and residents, one parcel deep surrounding the subject property, excluding right-of-way prior to filing the application for tourist home, and it goes on from there.
Okay, great. Mirta?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I completely support Julie's proposal. I think that notification goes to the core of public engagement, neighborhood engagement, which is something that we have been told time and again that needs to be improved. So this is a way to get that going. So I support it. My question is, with the notification, is it only residential or adjacent property owners, regardless of whether that's a commercial use or not? I think I had this question before, maybe last year, but I think it's important to notify everyone, regardless of whether you own a residential property or a commercial property. So just wanted some clarification.
The current requirement is for tourist homes located in R districts.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, we need to move on through the document. We've been crossing over into the noticing requirements section, so I'm going to do any additional questions on that next. So that is page 6 on the planning board document. That's amendments number 27 through 33. I'll give everyone a moment to get there. Are there any additional comments on or questions on the noticing section? Julie.
Jordan, so just your comment or your question to Jen was along the lines of if we put that notice language back in about the tourist homes, that it would be the only thing that's not in line with the other proposed notice changes. And I guess I just don't understand that. I mean, can we just, if we were to adopt this amendment to keep that notice in, can't we just add it to the table of application types that get noticed?
Yeah, I guess what I meant to say was that it would be inconsistent with other notice types, which, I'm not expressing an opinion one way or the other on that. I just was highlighting that it would be a deviation from what's in that table, if that helps, I guess. And so it could be an amendment to that table. Yeah.
Got it.
I want to highlight one thing. I am happy with the intent statement addition. I think and had a lot of conversations with staff leading up to this about why we notice, and I think we notice, at a minimum to meet legal requirements, to fulfill Title 20 requirements and state law requirements. But I think more broadly we notice to engage. To make people aware of changes in their neighborhood that may impact them, and to engage them in the most effective way possible. So this was really to contemplate that there are notices that are required that might be different than notices that are designed to engage and utilizing new tools like Engage Missoula or we reviewed some really interesting site postings that were highly visual and are frankly probably better ways to reach some people than a mailed notice. And so there was a lot of thought that went into trying to make notice more, trying to make information about projects more accessible and really demonstrating that public involvement is really critical to the success of these projects. So I'm happy with that change, and I wanted to just highlight that on the record. So no additional questions on notice, it looks like. So in the planning board document, we'll go back up to the bottom of page 4, coordination with Title 12 amendments. These are the amendments number 12 through 18. Are there questions on any of those or comments? Heather.
Sorry, Jordan, sometimes this just takes too long. I just want to say, I think those amendments that were proposed, I think were well thought out. And Jen, I just want to say thanks for presenting those.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And I'm not trying to exclude if anyone needs to jump back to any of these. I know we're moving through kind of quickly. So we'll try to use the document as a guide, but if we have to jump around, we will. So next up is conditional use. And I think we do have a decision point here as far as the 4 options regarding the planning board recommendations. So we can spend a little time talking through that. Just a point of process for Jen or anyone else who wants to answer it. Do we need a motion to amend to move in one of those directions, or what is the procedural tool that we need in order to move on to the public hearing for the conditional use section?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. Lavelle, do you have details?
Morning all, this is Lavelle Means, and similar to how you considered the planning board motion number 1 that was about notice, you should give us some guidance on incorporating the planning board motion or a few alternatives if you want to, setting up so the public knows what you're going to be considering at a public hearing. That's why we wanted to put those few options out there and ask you to give us some guidance. And if it seems like it's kind of quick, you can keep a couple of alternatives going if you'd like to.
Okay, and Lavelle, while we're talking about it, the proposed public hearing is October 5th. So we could, if we run out of time today, we could hold this over. We have a little bit of flexibility to have this back in LUP. That's correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. And the proposed, I would highlight that there's some Title 12 changes coming, and the proposal is to have both public hearings on the same time frame, just for consistency. So, okay, I have Julie up next.
Personally, I would propose the third option that been presented of the new language that staff has worked on around the conditional uses. I really appreciate the work towards trying to make the process so that an applicant doesn't have to do all of this detailed site design work before they even know whether or not their project has a possibility of being approved. So I think that is a great effort, and I appreciate the work that the staff has done to make that language more clear, and I fully support that intention.
I agree. I really appreciate all of that work as well. I do have a question that might help inform that decision. And I guess the question, I'll give a question, I'll state a question and then maybe state an example. What does anything about option 3 preclude reviewing some aspects of site design if it's relevant to the project? So the example that I'm thinking of is, suppose there's a tavern conditional use. We just saw one last year down on Higgins and Livingston, or the Higgins, South and Higgins. Suppose there's a tavern conditional use and council feels like it's important to have either access or outdoor seating on a certain side of the building or something like that in order to have the use fit well within the neighborhood. Would council be permitted under the proposed amendments to provide conditions around the site design in limited settings?
Jordan, the way that this is intended to work is that yes, the council would be able to impose conditions when it seems applicable that would affect and guide design. And again, the idea is that, before you go into a full design process, you want to know if there are other extenuating circumstances or other requirements, for example, like that before you get into, the full design process rather than finding out after you've gone through it.
Sure. So if a car wash use was wholly inappropriate in this area, they don't have to go through the whole process of designing the site. But if there are site design aspects that might mitigate the use or make the use fit in, those could be considered. So.
Sorry, I just lost you there at the end.
Yeah, no, I was just kind of restating my initial point, I guess, that site design wouldn't typically be considered unless site design was the only thing that would mitigate or that would make a use appropriate within an area.
And I would say that the example of an access, and providing an access or removing an access is a great example of the kind of what might come out of this kind of deliberation before you get into specific site design.
Okay, great, thanks. Heidi and then Stacy.
Thanks. So my question is, will someone please remind me where we are on TEDs and whether or not those are still conditional reviews? I just can't remember where we are.
I can respond to that one. Yeah, and since I'm familiar with that, the current status for TEDs is that there are no TEDs that go through conditional use. The most recent updates, again, limited the maximum number of units in a TED, the maximum size of a TED, and now they are all administrative. That's the current state of TEDs, and again, also ADUs are not conditional either. Those used to be some of the more frequent conditional uses that would come through.
Thank you.
And can I just clarify one other thing too? Just I forgot to bring this up when I was talking earlier, but just to clarify, at this point, the design excellence overlay does require that design excellence review occurs before conditional use approval. And at this point, we're not proposing that be changed. So this set of amendments really would only affect projects outside of the design excellence overlay. So something to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. Stacy and then Brian.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. So I actually want to go back to the scenario that you, Chairman, suggested about the, because I'm confused on the fact that if we don't have them have site design, how would we know to bring forth and say, hey, we think you should put seating on this side of your restaurant or whatever to kind of blend well into the neighborhood. I hear what Julie is saying about, putting such high bars, then having them to have all this pre-work, but then how are we getting enough information if we make this amendment to actually judge whether or not it fits well within the neighborhood and to be able to approve the conditional? I mean, it's coming for us as a conditional use per request for a reason. So I'm just wanting to make sure that we have enough information to be an educated guess, or not educate, an educated decision.
Yeah, I can respond to that too. And I kind of have 2 points to make, I guess. One is, again, that we have existing design standards that do address some of the impacts like that might come up. If they are spelled out in the zoning, like if it's a commercial use adjacent to a residential zoning district, or something like that, where there's already some kind of screening or buffering that might apply to that project. And so the conditional use is really the opportunity to look at these uses that are potentially more impactful and so deserving of a kind of case-by-case site-specific consideration. And so the idea here is that we would receive enough kind of information or enough to understand what is proposed with the use for the specific site to have an understanding of what's involved and to anticipate whether there are going to be impacts that would need mitigation, and not all of them will. Some of them will be, either not carry excessive impacts, or they'll be addressed in standards that we already have, or potentially if there are standards that we have that aren't working, maybe we, again, that's something else to focus on, to fine tune or update, potentially down the road too. But and then again, also there are comments that will be received, and agency comment and input from the community that will help bring up issues that you can consider on this kind of case-by-case basis. So the hope is that, with the project narrative and with responses to these other review criteria that are in that section that need to be addressed, even though you don't know exactly what the finished product is going to resemble, that you would have enough to work with to consider these kinds of decisions.
I have a follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Stacey.
So in that scenario that you just laid out, Ben, what sort of binding mechanisms are they required to, like the base level of information that they're giving you to make these decisions? Are they then sort of sticking with that? Or if they're still in the conceptual phase, kind of how much leeway do they have once the conditional use is granted?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that that kind of goes back to this question of what is substantial compliance, and how do we do that now, and how that might change for this. I think that there will be, it'll be important to look at how we craft our conditions so that it's clear what the expectation is. And currently, we refer a lot of our conditions back to a site plan or a design that you have in front of you, and so this would require some change in how that's put together, so that within the language of the condition itself, the applicant knows what they are being expected. And the way that we were proposing it now, in that that what would be a new compliance with conditions section, the idea is that there's a mechanism for if there is disagreement between the applicant and staff of how the condition is being applied, the applicant would go back for a conditional use through the amendment process that's in that section now, to resolve that if need be. But
okay, thanks. Next I have Brian.
Jordan, I was just hoping we could get the slide up on the screen that had the 3 choice, or the 4, I'm sorry. Thanks.
Okay. While this is up, does anyone have any additional questions on the conditional use section? Okay, we have 2 additional sections. We have signs, which is question or amendments number 24 through 26. And we have the miscellaneous section, which is amendments number 34 through 41. I know that there was a question, I think it was Amber, but correct me if I'm wrong, that on the landscaping and activity area. Maybe whoever had that question can let me know and we can go back to that.
Thank you. So could you go back to the, I just feel like I need to understand the landscaping piece a little better and what changes we're making. Do you mind going back to that slide?
So there's 2 amendments in the landscaping. Pardon?
Maybe it was 33.
It looks like amendments number 38 and 39 relate to the landscaping section. There's number 38 is to include additional guidance making garden areas more useful. Number 39 is to require an explanation of how a proposed landscaping plan meets the intent of the landscaping chapter.
Okay, let's move on because I'm not totally sure what my question was now. I have some sloppy notes here, so I'll ask. I was taking quick notes, but I do have some question around that, but I don't want to hold up the meeting, so I can ask that directly to them.
Okay, great. Any additional questions? Okay, we have about 10 minutes left in the meeting. We have 2 meeting attendees who have been waiting patiently. I'd like to move to public comment, and then I think what we need to do, we have a few amendments that are going to be somewhat substantive in the discussion. So I think we have 2 options. I think we can get those amendments into the record, and we can submit both of those for a public hearing draft. I think that might be the best option because that would signal to the public that there's pretty broad consensus or lack of controversy on some of the amendments, but that particularly the amendments around ADU parking and tourist home notice requirements would be moving forward to the public hearing. Alternatively, we could have this back in committee sometime in September, and we could work those out in committee so that there's a single public hearing draft. So at this point, I'm going to move to public comment. I have Mr. Larson, and Mr. Larson, we are in receipt of your emails and your Engage Missoula comments. Thank you for those.
So Engage Missoula is working. That's cool, because definitely the budget topic isn't. But maybe I'll just have to file another 3rd formal complaint against the communications department to get them kind of going again on that one. I want you guys to refer this to committee again. Removing the owner occupancy is dumb. Removing the parking requirements is dumb. Removing and shortening the notice for tourist homes is despicable and utterly ridiculous. You need to address the community at large. We know Airbnbs do nothing but raise the rents here. We know it does this nationwide. We've talked about it for 2 years now. 2 years. We've been telling you to put in a ban or an injunction against Airbnbs and VBROs. And now you're just gutting 43 amendments on Title 20. What are you going to gut 80 next year? It's sold to us as a plan, and then it's totally reinvented into some completely different monster. And it's unacceptable. What are you doing? Why are you ruining this town? You're only increasing tax basis by adding ADUs. You're essentially catering to out-of-state real estate investors, and it's ridiculous. And the entire community is up in arms about this. There's even people amongst the mayor's majority who don't even think this is a good idea. So I would suggest to those people, you're thinking right. You're thinking right. You're seeing what is actually going on. They're actually catering to create more tourist rentals and create them faster and easier than possible. And so I disagree that we can deal with this next year or 2 years down the line, because we can't uncreate these houses. And you don't even have any control over the Airbnb stuff as is. So what's going on? Why are you doing this? Why are you reinventing the Title 20 codes that have existed since the 30s in the university area? With the absence of this type of regulation, we got all the affordable housing, quote unquote, that exists there. These massive block constructions of massive multi-unit rentals that are ugly. And they're just horrible. And to create a special condition for the university district is, I think, indicative of how this is pandering to the oligarchy of Missoula, the real estate oligarchy and the landlord oligarchy. I know people who live in illegal apartments in the basement where it's easier to lock them in than it is to lock people out. They're fire code dangers, and it's ridiculous. You've overregulated the county and the city as far as construction, and now you're lifting all the bans to create more Airbnbs. That is so despicable and so against the character of Missoula. You're stressing the roads, the schools, the public services like firemen and police. And as far as I can tell, the police are stressed enough with what's going on at MPD. But that's a whole nother topic. I hope that you all read my email I sent to you last night, as it is very imperative for your next meeting, the Budget Committee of the whole. Stop shoving down these initiatives down the throats of the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Any additional public comment? Okay, seeing none, we have about 5 minutes left, and I think actually it would be worthwhile. Julie, do you have a comment?
It was about the parking. I don't know if we want to talk about that now with 5 minutes left or not. It maybe is not a good time to take up that comment, that line.
And I apologize, I missed a public comment. Our other attendee. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to tell you about Danny's public comment.
Yeah, I just saw that. Thank you. So Danny Tenenbaum, you're welcome to give your comment.
Hi, sorry. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
I just want to say that I support pretty much all of the amendments proposed. I looked over them quite carefully. One concern I have, though, is with the neighborhood exception for the removal of the parking requirements. I will say that pivoting away from car-centric land use rules is a priority of people who have been advocating on the fight against climate change. And it's our belief that the removal of parking requirements should apply citywide without exceptions for any specific neighborhoods. I know equity is a key element of the strategic framework that was universally passed for considering budget amendments. And I don't think ordinance changes should really be any different. I think equity should be a central element of the decision-making process. So I just asked to ensure that the ADU rules, including the removal of parking requirements, apply universally and without any exceptions for any neighborhoods that have traditionally held, I would say, increased sway in decision-making at the city level. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tenenbaum. Appreciate it. So I'm going to return to the speaker list here. Julie, go ahead, and then Heidi's next.
Okay, I guess the thought I was having was you suggested that the amendments that we put forth would be ones that are kind of generally accepted. And I would say at first blush, I'm not accepting of an amendment that would accept the university district from the parking regulation changes with ADUs. It seems to me that it's kind of blue on black. I mean, the problem already exists, a handful of additional cars with a handful of additional ADUs. It's hard to see how that, I don't know how else to describe it. It's just blue on black. It's already a problem of parking around the university, no doubt. I just don't see that it's going to have that big of an impact considering the low numbers of ADUs we've seen.
Okay, I appreciate that. So what I'd like to do is entertain a main motion, which we should have had earlier, but a motion to set the public hearing. That motion could include one of the options for the conditional uses, and then we can address any amendments from that. So, Mr. Ramos.
I will just make the recommended motion for the whole package there.
Okay, and can you clarify, my preference would be for us to utilize option number 3 within the conditional uses to take the new staff recommendations. Can you clarify what your intent is?
Yeah, I'll make the recommended motion with option number 3 to reflect the staff recommendations.
Okay, so that motion is in order. So I think if we have a little bit of a longer break between this and Public Works. So if we can go a couple minutes over, I think we can take care of the amendments now. I think that's actually a better, apologies for changing course on that. I think that's actually a better approach. Stacy?
So then I agree, and I don't know if Heidi had made this amendment, or I guess the only amendment that to the motion is I think we should stick with the notification. Now, where to craft that, I'm not sure. So, but
yeah, I believe that was Julie's proposed motion. Julie?
All right, then I will look forward to hearing Julie's proposed motion.
Okay, my proposed motion would be to keep the language about the notification of ADU applications and then add that as an item to the nice table that staff created about notice. Is one of the items that needs to be added to that table is the ADU application notification. That makes sense.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, Jen?
I thought we were talking about tourist homes previously. Were you talking about ADUs?
Tourist homes. I'm sorry. My brain is getting overtaxed. I apologize.
Thank you.
Okay, so to restate that for clarity is to maintain the existing tourist home notifications in addition to the proposed changes and to integrate those in the table.
Thank you.
Okay, so that motion is in order. Is there discussion on the motion? Jesse, I've got your hand up from earlier. I'm not sure if that's on this or just on the main motion.
Oh, that's a miss.
Okay, Sandra?
Just a clarifying question. Is this one just purely Julie's motion and not the one to exclude the university district from the parking regulations?
Yep, this is just the motion on the notification for the tourist homes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And then Heidi?
I was just going to say that I support her motion. I think it's, prudent to notify our neighbors, whether those are the owners or the renters. And I like the existing language that we have.
Okay, great. Brian and then Gwen.
I support it as well. I just wanted to clarify process-wise. So is Julie's motion an amendment to the main motion?
That's correct.
Okay.
Gwen?
I would just add, earlier I spoke about the fact that people can walk around and get the address, and there is I meant to flesh that out. That's for people who are living adjacent, and then there could be owners who are not living on site, but
Gwen, you ended up muted.
sorry, if people are going to be running a tourist home and handling the computer logistics of those platforms, I think they can either, as Julie said, hire someone who will handle a notification if they have difficulties looking up addresses of property owners, or like I said, if they're actually going to be running a tourist home and handling the computer logistics, they can figure out cadastral and look those up themselves. So I don't think the Office of Development needs to hold their hand that much. They need to tell them to do it, and these people need to figure it out. So I'm in favor of it. Thanks for making it, Julie.
Jesse?
Can I go ahead and accept this as a friendly amendment?
Yep, that's acceptable.
Perfect. I'll do that.
Okay. So that is done. Gwen?
So I articulated my amendment earlier. I don't know if you want to hear that now, if we've got time, or if you want to kick it further down the road, George.
Let's go ahead and take care of that. I think we've had enough discussion on this over the past meetings that I think it would be good to signal a clear committee intention for the public hearing. And of course, there would be the opportunity to further amend at the public hearing or to refer back to committee again.
Got it. Okay. Can I just speak to it I think I articulated it well enough. I think everybody understands it. The one additional point I want to make is right now, if you drive over to the 200 or 300 block in the University District of all of the streets heading east-west, you can't park it's full because school is now in session. There is no parking. The whole premise of us eliminating parking requirements is when there is flow on the street and it can be accommodated. So I do think this is a short-term scenario. Ultimately, if the residential parking permit program is reworked and the parking commission reworks their jurisdiction and they handle this holistically, it's a conversation to have down the road. But right now, it doesn't work. And I think it does need to be carved out because it is unreasonable to put this on top of it if more ADUs go in without any parking carved out. So there you go. That's
Can you please just briefly restate state your motion so it's in the record?
Sure. I would state that the parking requirement for ADUs shall be retained and not exempted out for the geographical area, which is bounded by two separate maps, including the historic neighborhood district of the University District, as well as the residential parking permit program boundary map also. And if those areas are exempted then from, sorry, we're getting into double negatives. Basically, in those areas, there still will be a parking requirement for ADUs until there is a further addressing of the parking issues by the parking commission in that neighborhood.
Okay, thanks. Next is Heidi.
Muted.
Heidi, you're still muted.
I can't work my own laptop. So I understand the pressures on the university district parking, but I do think that this is one of the most appropriate places to have ADU development because it can be done within the neighborhood character. It's located close to the university and to other services. I think that we need to think of development in some ways as separate from cars and parking and more about people, and not just assume that they come with vehicles. I think there's some really exciting higher density projects that are going into kind of our urban core that don't have any parking associated with them for a variety of reasons. So in that vein, I don't support this amendment just because I think we should be able to absorb people in the existing infrastructure, and we should shift towards, not being reliant on vehicles, not assuming that everyone comes with a car.
Sorry, now I was muted. Amber and then Heather.
So with the ADU program currently, if you're building an ADU, would you have and someone is renting that, would they get a permit in those permitted parking places, just like people that live in the university district? So I guess that's one question. And I'd also like to, I don't understand where the historic district boundaries are in making this and thinking about this motion. So I'm not sure where I am on this right now. Could someone answer those two things?
Gwen or Jen as well?
I don't have the knowledge I was going to admit, so if Gwen can answer those, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So if you are in the boundaries of the RPPP and you have an address there, you can get a permit. But if you are not within the boundaries, which is blocks 100, 200, 300, that's where the great impact is. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm including the whole area because it gets too complicated otherwise. But the bottom line is, from now until eternity, as long as we have a flagship university in Missoula, parking in the 400 and 500 blocks will be greatly impacted. There's just no way around it. So I think there always will be a need for extra capacity in those areas. The historic district boundaries run from the river to the alley in between Evans and Beckwith. and from Arthur to Higgins. The RPP is a little bit of a different boundary that crosses over into Victory Fields a little bit, if that answers your question.
It does. May I have a follow-up, Jordan?
Yep, briefly.
I'm curious about what the process would be. I know that Gwen, you spoke to, as we do more of a study about traffic, that we could amend this. Would that be just something we would do as an annual amendment to Title 20, or like how, if we were to vote this special area in, how would we amend that, and what would be the timing and that we would be able to amend that?
So the Parking Commission needs to look at, number one, expanding their jurisdiction. And then number two, they need to do an in-depth parking study of that entire area. And the goal is to have 80% full parking on the streets at any one time. So there's always flow, there's always some available spots, but that you're using the great majority of those spots. So that would be a big shift in how all the parking worked in that area. If that was addressed, in my mind, that then would be accommodating in whatever form they use, that would accommodate ADUs. And then they might not be able to park in front of your house, but hopefully on your block. Right now, that's not an option. You can't necessarily park on your block for great big swaths of the day. And so that if the Parking Commission addressed it, then I think we could do this in Title 20 cleanup.
Gwen, I'm gonna cut you off, and I'm gonna ask that you withdraw your amendment as a function of time, and that we bring it back either before the public hearing or at the public hearing. I think that it would be a disservice to shortchange the discussion here, and we are 10 minutes over time.
I'm happy to withdraw it. No one ever said parking was easy.
Yep, exactly. So we'll work through this at a later time. We do have a motion on the floor to set the public hearing, which again is our official vehicle to receive public comment, with the notification modification to the tourist homes to preserve the notification for tourist homes, and also to proceed with option 3 with regard to the conditional use. And then, so we've had good discussion on that. I will allow extremely brief public comment on this motion. It's substantively identical to what we've been discussing. Would anyone like to provide comment? Seeing none, we will have a roll call vote on this item, please.
I'm Jordan. I don't agree with the notification one. I wanted to vote on that separately, if that's possible.
It's been accepted into by Jesse as a friendly amendment, so that's in the main motion. So if
well, it'll pass probably anyway, so I'll just withdraw that. Never mind.
Okay, and my suggestion is, we're setting a public hearing, so there would be an opportunity to state that at the public hearing and to bring that back up as another amendment at that time, if you're comfortable with that. So, okay, thanks. With that, we can go ahead and have a roll call vote.
Stacy Anderson,
Yes.
Bertha Becerra,
Yes.
John Contos,
Yes.
Heather Harp,
Yes.
Jordan Hess,
Yes.
Gwen Jones,
Yes.
Julie Merritt,
Yes.
Jesse Ramos,
Yes.
Amber Scherer,
Yes.
Sandra Beseca,
Yes.
Brian Losberg,
Yes.
Heidi Best.
Yes.
Okay, that's a unanimous vote, 12 ayes and 0 nays, and that is to set the public hearing. We will work on scheduling for additional discussion on parking. Thank you, everyone, for your indulgence going a little long. We will be adjourned.